He said a healthy society should have more than one voice. It should have more than one voice. And so this is a bit of an effort just to have a conversation with friends in China. It's sometimes difficult to cut through the noise from whether it's propaganda from the wholly state-owned media in China, or the carefully curated social media ecosystem in China, which is that ecosystem is shockingly lacking in diversity when it comes to these sorts of issues that the intellectuals were wrestling with 100 years ago. It's enormously diverse on a zillion other things. I mean, but not on these questions about politics, about modernizing culture, about history. And so this is an effort to reach out in the Chinese language and open up a conversation with friends in China and around the world.
Shirley, you're on mute.
That's right. Thank you very much, Matt. Now we're on to the exciting part of the program. We have lots of excellent questions from many people who actually know you already, Matt, but we're going to be fair and pick the best questions. So on to Harry.
Yes, hi, Matt. Thanks very much. Our first question comes from a viewer named Mo Roping. And he noted that you described both the Brexit movement and the election of Donald Trump, as well as the May 4th movement, as being populist. And so what he asks is, how do you relate Trump's election to the White House to the spirit of the May 4th movement?
It's a great question. When we were rather hastily piecing together this speech over the weekend, and I was working with a couple of friends to translate what I wrote in English first into Chinese so that I could deliver it in Chinese. I wrestled a lot with the Chinese term for populism, because the term for populism in Chinese, it's usually translated as 民粹主义, and there is a pejorative ring to that term. And so I took a friend's advice to use a different term, and it was 平民主义, which 平民 is like citizens or civilians. So it's the idea again of citizenship being at the heart of the enterprise, at the heart of the politics, and so I think that whether it's China or the United States or the UK or Brazil or really any part of the world, there is a fundamental question about government that is citizen-centric and government that is regime-centric, and that it's a perennial old issue, and it's one that was really what May 4th movement intellectuals were grappling with. And so I think that there are currents, there are a lot of forms of populism, what I'm talking about, and I think what the wave that brought President Trump into office is what I would call a democratic populism. It was a effort, more than an effort, it was an expression of frustration on the parts of the American people that a powerful elite was growing too remote and too self-interested in the views of so many people. And I think that was actually a decisive factor in that election, just as it was in the Brexit vote. And so I thought that was a terrific question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And we'll go on to the next question now, who comes from Will Malden. And he thanks you for the presentation. And he says, with some in the administration calling for the US to take measures against China for allowing or covering up the coronavirus outbreak, does Washington have any economic options it could use without blowing up the 3-month-old phase 1 trade agreement?
Yeah, so look, the best authority on this is President Trump himself, who talked about this actually just yesterday in a town hall meeting. So the U.S. isn't looking at punitive measures here. What President Trump is looking at doing is continuing with the policy that he ran on, the policy that he's implemented, which is to have a reciprocal and fair relationship with China, not one in which the U.S. Allows ourselves to be taken advantage of in the hope that somehow China will just automatically liberalize. That has not happened. In fact, in many respects, Chinese friends of mine believe that China is moving in a much more illiberal direction in recent years, following the entry into the WTO in 2001. Some have argued that China coming to the WTO did not hasten or accelerate a move towards liberalism, but actually removed the impetus for further reforms in the market realm, as well as certainly in the political realm, because the entry into the WTO allowed China's system to become much wealthier through its access to capital and access to overseas markets in Europe and the United States and so on. I referred to President Trump's remarks yesterday. We have a deal, an initial phase one trade deal that was signed at the beginning of this year. President Trump has every expectation and desire to see China fulfill its end of the bargain, and he's made clear that he's not going to remove tariffs. The tariffs are what allowed us to gave us the leverage to actually achieve that deal in the first place. And he's going to be watching very carefully to make sure that China holds up its end of the bargain.
Thank you. Next one comes from Professor Rana Mitter. Congratulations on your fluent and thoughtful speech. My question is, the May 4th spirit included genuine cosmopolitanism and learning from each other's cultures, and China learned much from the West during May 4th. What can we in the West learn from China's May 4th experience?
So, that's a great question, and I think Professor Mitter would give a much better answer than I can, given how well steeped he is in this history. I mentioned in my remarks the example of Zhang Pengchun, P.C. Chang, who I think I used his example because he was someone who did come to the United States on one of those indemnity scholarships, just like Hu Shi. He studied under the great Du Wei, John Dewey, who was a very influential educator and philosopher at Columbia University. He learned a lot about theater and brought some of that back to China. But the really interesting thing about P.C. Chang is that he then came back to the West with a head full of ideas about how China should influence the world, how it should influence conversations about philosophy. And most decisively, his biggest contribution was his role in drafting the Declaration on Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt, she chaired that panel, and that was adopted in the late 40s as this seminal document designed to try to prevent humanity from descending into the horrors of the first half of the 20th century ever again. And so P.C. Chang brought to the table a very Chinese perspective. He said that human rights is not exclusively the domain of Western Christianity. It is not the domain of ancient Western philosophy. There are currents, very strong currents of human rights in Confucianism and in the long, 2 millennia following Confucius. And so he had a decisive effect in really putting the word universal into the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So I think that's one potent example. Thank you.
Thank you.
Matt, the next question comes from someone who I think you know, Jaime Florcruz, also a journalist. And he says, aside from invoking or inviting Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science to come to China, the other legacy of the May 4th movement was the popular vote or even obsession of
振兴中华
to rejuvenate China and to oppose foreign bullying. Do you agree with that? And how does that affect American policy toward China today? How do you coexist with the people and a political power who wish to make their nation great again and that resents being told that they should should do bullying?
What they should do to fight off bullying.
What they should do to fight off bullying.
Yeah, great. It's great to know that Jaime Flores is on the line, and thanks for the question. It's been a long time. It'd be great to see you sometime. The rejuvenation of China absolutely was one of the core themes as well of the May 4th movement. And of course, it's called the May 4th movement because students were so outraged by China's shoddy treatment by all the powers in Japan at the Treaty of Versailles talks that they took to the streets. You know, China's felt like it was being carved up. China didn't fight as a combatant in World War I, but it did provide a lot of labor into Europe on the side of the Allies. And it got a really raw deal. The Versailles Treaty was a raw deal for a lot of people in a lot of countries. China got a really raw deal on that, which is why people took to the streets. And when they weren't allowed to continue the demonstration, some of the students went and actually burned down a few houses of Chinese officials. One of the Chinese officials whose house got burnt down was an official who had accepted a very predatory loan by the Japanese government to China that they thought would surrender, in essence, Chinese sovereignty to the Japanese through debt diplomacy. And so they burnt down that official's house. So rejuvenating China, I don't know anyone who has ever, who spent significant time in China who did not, especially in the years leading up to the turn of the century. You know, I was lucky to work as a journalist in the late 90s in China because it was a hopeful moment. There was a lot of reform going on of the economy. There was the beginning of the internet in the early days in China. The internet was a little bit more wild and free, and you did hear more of that plurality of voices that Li Wenliang so sorely missed, as he commented on his deathbed. No foreigner that I knew in that time wasn't rooting for China to rejuvenate. People were rooting for China's success. We were rooting for the success of the Chinese people, and we took enormous pleasure in the creativity, entrepreneurial spirit, and drive of the Chinese people over the course of the reform and opening period before that period ended just a handful of years ago. I think that it's hard to argue that reform and opening still exists as we interpret it at that point. But in terms of bullying and so forth, there's a danger. I talked at the end of my remarks, the Chinese portion, about balancing nationalism and this instinct to be great again with responsive, accountable government. If you do introduce democratic norms and you do have a more accountable government, it actually makes the odds of greatness for the country even greater.
Thank you, Matt. We're quickly running out of time, but if we could extend your time for one more question. This is from Ted Pulling. Matt, you lived in Hong Kong and know the city well. How do you see events playing out in that city? And maybe you could reference the impending legislative election, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Is it worth Washington's time to get involved in Hong Kong, or is it an internal matter for Beijing?
Yeah, look, the Sino-British joint declaration which allowed for the return of Hong Kong to China, is a document that is clearly binding. It's a binding document. It was a document that was recognized by governments around the world as such. It was a document that was registered as a treaty at the United Nations. The U.S. is watching with real concern the erosion of the promises that were made on the Chinese side of that agreement. And frankly, I mentioned in my Chinese remarks the example of the millions of people in Hong Kong who took to the streets peacefully last year, peacefully. Millions of people. We're talking about a massive percentage. It was of Hong Kongers got on their feet and went out into the streets to advocate for their rights under the basic law, what was promised to them as part of that Sino-British joint declaration, and really, in essence, in support of maintaining the rule of law. And the rule of law is sometimes mistranslated. In fact, it's uniformly mistranslated by the Chinese government as 依法治国, which is a little sleight of hand that means using the law to run a country rather than the law being supreme to the men and women who have the privilege of serving in government. And so 法治 in the true sense is as I defined it in the speech.
Thanks. Here's a question from Drew Thompson. Matt, you mentioned Taiwan in your speech. Can you elaborate on how Taiwan's democratic system shapes U.S. policy towards the island? With 23 million people, is Taiwan, in your opinion, a viable model for a much larger China?
Yeah, Drew, thanks for the question. And you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, PC Chang resigned his job as an official. He was a storied diplomat. He'd been China's ambassador to several countries and several different civilizations, different parts of the world. And in the end, after his work on the Universal Declaration, he resigned because he was frustrated with the lack of progress towards democracy. And I can't speak to how he would view it today, but I think that Taiwan has been a pretty astonishing example of, shows sort of the bankruptcy of the claim that China's not ready or Chinese people aren't suited to democracy and so forth. That's not to say that that's what we're foisting on anybody. As I mentioned in the speech, how China governs itself is going to be up to the Chinese people. It's not for anyone else to decide. The May 4th movement belongs to the Chinese people. There's a lot that we've learned for Chinese societies, including in Taiwan. So the reason I spoke in Chinese was that it goes to that sort of what I was mentioning about this sort of shocking lack of diversity in voices. It's like what Dr. Li Wenliang said after his incredible contribution to all of us in raising the alarm about that virus before he succumbed to the virus in Wuhan. He said it's a healthy society should have more than one voice. It should have more than one voice. And so this is a bit of an effort just to have a conversation with friends in China. It's sometimes difficult to cut through the noise from whether it's propaganda from the wholly state-owned media in China or the carefully curated social media ecosystem in China, which is that ecosystem is shockingly lacking in diversity when it comes to these sorts of issues that the intellectuals were wrestling with 100 years ago. It's enormously diverse on a zillion other things. I mean, but not on these questions about about politics, about modernizing culture, about history. And so this is an effort to reach out in the Chinese language and open up a conversation with friends in China and around the world.
Shirley, you're on mute.
That's right. Thank you very much, Matt. Now we're on to the exciting part of the program. We have lots of excellent questions from many people who actually know you already, Matt, but we're going to be fair and pick the best questions. So on to Harry.
Yes, hi, Matt. Thanks very much. Our first question comes from a viewer named Melur Ra. And he noted that you described both the Brexit movement and the election of Donald Trump, as well as the May 4th movement, as being populist. And so what he asks is, how do you relate Trump's election to the White House to the spirit of the May 4th movement?
It's a great question. When we were rather hastily piecing together this speech over the weekend, and I was working with a couple of friends to translate what I wrote in English first into Chinese so that I could deliver it in Chinese. I wrestled a lot with the Chinese term for populism, because the term for populism in Chinese, it's usually translated as 民粹主义. And there is a pejorative ring to that term. And so I took a friend's advice to use a different term. And it was 平民主义, which 平民 is like citizens or civilians. So it's the idea again of citizenship being at the heart of the enterprise, at the heart of the politics. And so I think that whether it's China or the United States or the UK or Brazil or really any part of the world, there is a fundamental question about government that is citizen-centric and government that is regime-centric, and that it's a perennial old issue, and it's one that was really what May 4th movement intellectuals were grappling with. And so I think that there are currents, there are a lot of forms of populism. What I'm talking about, and I think what the wave that brought President Trump into office is what I would call a democratic populism. It was a effort, more than an effort, it was an expression of frustration on the parts of the American people that a powerful elite was growing too remote and too self-interested in the views of so many people. And I think that was actually a decisive factor in that election, just as it was in the Brexit vote. And so I thought that was a terrific question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And we'll go on to the next question now, who comes from Will Malden. And he thanks you for the presentation. And he says, with some in the administration calling for the US to take measures against China for allowing or covering up the coronavirus outbreak, does Washington have any economic options it could use without blowing up the 3-month-old phase 1 trade agreement?
Yeah, so look, the best authority on this is President Trump himself, who talked about this actually just yesterday in a town hall meeting. So the U.S. isn't looking at punitive measures here. What President Trump is looking at doing is continuing with the policy that he ran on, the policy that he's implemented, which is to have a reciprocal and fair relationship with China, not one in which the U.S. Allows ourselves to be taken advantage of in the hope that somehow China will just automatically liberalize. That has not happened. In fact, in many respects, Chinese friends of mine believe that China is moving in a much more illiberal direction in recent years, following the entry into the WTO in 2001. Some have argued that China coming to the WTO did not hasten or accelerate a move towards liberalism, but actually removed the impetus for further reforms in the market realm, as well as certainly in the political realm, because the entry into the WTO allowed China's system to become much wealthier through its access to capital and access to overseas markets in Europe and the United States and so on. I referred to President Trump's remarks yesterday. We have a deal, an initial phase 1 trade deal that was signed at the beginning of this year. President Trump has every expectation and desire to see China fulfill its end of the bargain, and he's made clear that he's not going to remove tariffs. The tariffs are what allowed us gave us the leverage to actually achieve that deal in the first place. And he's going to be watching very carefully to make sure that China holds up its end of the bargain.
Thank you. Next one comes from Professor Rana Mitter. Congratulations on your fluent and thoughtful speech. My question is, the May 4th spirit included genuine cosmopolitanism and learning from each other's cultures, and China learned much from the West during May 4th. What can we in the West learn from China's May 4th experience?
So, that's a great question, and I think Professor Mitter would give a much better answer than I can, given how well steeped he is in this history. I mentioned in my remarks the example of Zhang Pengchun, PC Chang, who I think I used his example because he was someone who did come to the United States on one of those indemnity scholarships, just like Hu Shi. He studied under the great Dewey, John Dewey, who was a very influential educator and philosopher at Columbia University. He learned a lot about theater and brought some of that back to China. But the really interesting thing about PC Chang is that he then came back to the West with a head full of ideas about how China should influence the world, how it should influence conversations about philosophy. And most decisively, his biggest contribution was his role in drafting the Declaration on Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt, she chaired that panel, and that was adopted in the late 40s as this seminal document designed to try to prevent humanity from descending into the horrors of the first half of the 20th century ever again. And so PC Chang brought to the table a very Chinese perspective. He said that human rights is not exclusively the domain of Western Christianity. It is not the domain of ancient Western philosophy. There are currents, very strong currents of human rights in Confucianism and in the long 2 millennia following Confucius. And so he had a decisive effect in really putting the word universal into the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So I think that's one potent example. Thank you.
Thank you.
Matt, the next question comes from someone who I think you know, Jaime Florcruz, also a journalist. And he says, aside from inviting Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science to come to China, the other legacy of the May 4th movement was the popular goal or even obsession of Zhengxing Zhonghua to rejuvenate China and to oppose foreign bullying. Do you agree with that? And how does that affect American policy toward China today? How do you coexist with the people and a political power who wish to make their nation great again and that resents being told that they should should do bullying?
What they should do to fight off bullying.
Right, what they should do to fight off bullying.
Yeah, great. It's great to know that Jaime Florcruz is on the line, and thanks for the question. It's been a long time. It'd be great to see you sometime. The rejuvenation of China absolutely was one of the core themes as well of the May 4th movement. And of course, it's called the May 4th movement because students were so outraged by China's shoddy treatment by all the powers in Japan at the Treaty of Versailles talks that they took to the streets. You know, China's felt like it was being carved up. China didn't fight as a combatant in World War I, but it did provide a lot of labor into Europe on the side of the Allies, and it got a really raw deal. The Versailles Treaty was a raw deal for a lot of people in a lot of countries. China got a really raw deal on that, which is why people took to the streets. And when they weren't allowed to continue the demonstration, some of the students went and actually burned down a few houses of Chinese officials. One of the Chinese officials whose house got burnt down was an official who had accepted a very predatory loan by the Japanese government to China that they thought would surrender, in essence, Chinese sovereignty to the Japanese through debt diplomacy. And so they burnt down that official's house. So rejuvenating China, I don't know anyone who has ever, who spent significant time in China who did not, especially in the years leading up to the turn of the century. You know, I was lucky to work as a journalist in the late 90s in China because it was a hopeful moment. There was a lot of reform going on of the economy. There was the beginning of the internet in the early days in China. The internet was a little bit more wild and free, and you did hear more of that plurality of voices that Li Wenliang so sorely missed, as he commented on his deathbed. No foreigner that I knew in that time wasn't rooting for China to rejuvenate. People were rooting for China's success. We were rooting for the success of the Chinese people, and we took enormous pleasure in the creativity, entrepreneurial spirit, and drive of the Chinese people over the course of the reform and opening period before that period ended just a handful of years ago. I think that it's hard to argue that reform and opening still exists as we interpret it at that point. But in terms of bullying and so forth, there's a danger. I talked at the end of my remarks, the Chinese portion, about balancing nationalism and this instinct to be great again with responsive, accountable government. If you do introduce democratic norms and you do have a more accountable government, it actually makes the odds of greatness for the country even greater.
Thank you, Matt. We're quickly running out of time, but if we could extend your time for one more question. This is from Ted Pulling. Matt, you lived in Hong Kong and know the city well. How do you see events playing out in that city? And maybe you could reference the impending LegCo election, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Is it worth Washington's time to get involved in Hong Kong, or is it an internal matter for Beijing?
Yeah, look, the Sino-British joint declaration, which allowed for the return of Hong Kong to China, is a document that is clearly binding. It's a binding document. It was a document that was recognized by governments around the world as such. It was a document that was registered as a treaty at the United Nations. The U.S. is watching with real concern the erosion of the promises that were made on the Chinese side of that agreement. And frankly, I mentioned in my Chinese remarks the example of the millions of people in Hong Kong who took to the streets peacefully last year, peacefully, millions of people. We're talking about a massive percentage. It was of Hong Kongers got on their feet and went out into the streets to advocate for their rights under the basic law, what was promised to them as part of that Sino-British joint declaration, and really, in essence, in support of maintaining the rule of law. And the rule of law is sometimes mistranslated. In fact, it's uniformly mistranslated by the Chinese government as 依法治国, which is a little sleight of hand that means using the law to run a country rather than the law being supreme to the men and women who have the privilege of serving in government. And so 法治 in the true sense is as I defined it in the speech.
Thanks. Here's a question from Drew Thompson. Matt, you mentioned Taiwan in your speech. Can you elaborate on how Taiwan's democratic system shapes US policy towards the island? With 23 million people, is Taiwan, in your opinion, a viable model for a much larger China?
Yeah, Drew, thanks for the question. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, PC Chang resigned his job as an official. You know, he was a storied diplomat. He'd been China's ambassador to several countries and several different different civilizations, different parts of the world. And in the end, after his work on the Universal Declaration, he resigned because he was frustrated with the lack of progress towards democracy. And I can't speak to how he would view it today, but I think that Taiwan has been a pretty astonishing example of, you know, shows sort of the bankruptcy of the claim that China's not ready or Chinese people aren't suited to democracy and so forth. That's not to say that that's what we're foisting on anybody. As I mentioned in the speech, how China governs itself is going to be up to the Chinese people. It's not for anyone else to decide. The May 4th movement belongs to the Chinese people. There's a lot that we've learned from it, but it belongs to them. And the speech today was really just an attempt to remind a current generation of friends in the United States and in China and elsewhere of the legacy of that movement.
Well, thanks very much, Pat. I wish we had more time. We have lots more questions. But having heard your keynote speech, we now have a second keynote conversation with James Steinberg. That will be introduced and moderated by Bill Antholis. Over to you, Bill.
Well, Shirley, Harry, and Matt, thank you so much. We're now thrilled to turn to the Honorable James Steinberg here with us. Jim has been a major force in crafting U.S. foreign policy for over 30 years. Among other governmental and research positions, Jim was Deputy National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton, the same position that Matt holds now, and then Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration for Secretary Hillary Clinton. Like Harry, he's twice been a dean at the LBJ School and the Maxwell School, and was vice president and head of research at Brookings, as well as a research analyst at RAND. Full disclosure, I've worked for Jim twice in government, and he helped bring me to Brookings. But since I no longer work for him, I can say without conflict of interest that he is widely regarded, including by me, as the leading foreign policy thinker of our time. Among other things, Jim has played a critical role in designing the architecture of China policy under Presidents Clinton and Obama, and then helping implement it. He helped manage a period that saw rapid integration between the US and China, a process that was in many ways mutually beneficial, but which also has generated its share of tensions. As Matt mentioned, particularly in the 90s, there were enormous periods of great optimism. But now we're in a particularly rough patch. So we're delighted to have Jim walk us through the challenges of cooperating with a rival. Jim, we know we'll get you back to Charlottesville soon, but for the meantime, thanks for zooming in from Cazenovia outside of Syracuse.
Well, thanks, Bill. It's great to be here. I wish I could replicate Matt's impressive speech in Mandarin, but I can simply say ni hao to our Chinese friends, and thank you for having me.
So let's start with the big picture, Jim. After 25 years of trying to cooperate with China, we're now arguably at a low point in the relationship. So what went wrong? Were we too optimistic, as Matt pointed out, about optimism about what cooperation with China might achieve?
Well, it's a great question, Bill. And I think you're right in characterizing it as a low point. I think it's important as we think about this particular low point to recall some of the other low points that we experienced in the history of U.S.-China relations. Matt touched on a few going back to the Versailles Peace Conference, but also to recall how low the times were when China entered the Korean War and threatened our troops, when it shelled the islands off its coast and towards Taiwan in the 1950s. And for me, particularly because it's the time that I became personally involved directly in U.S.-China relations, was in the aftermath of Tiananmen and the difficulties of that time as well. So we've experienced a lot of difficulties. We've overcome them in the past. That doesn't guarantee the past performance is no guarantee of future returns. And I do think we face a unique set of challenges now. You asked a really important question, what went wrong? I gave a speech last year about that, wrote an article in the Texas National Security Review for those interested, looking at the history of all this and trying to understand both what our expectations were, particularly from my time in the Clinton administration, and then what's been responsible for the difficulties that we've had since then. I think the first thing to say is that, and this question about whether we were overly optimistic, I think as you go back and revisit the thinking of the time and how we saw this during the 90s, I think Matt Pottinger had it exactly right, which is that we believed that on the whole, there was a better chance that there would be good relations between the United States and China if China were a successful, prosperous country rather than a struggling, difficult one that felt surrounded and under pressure. And I think that a case can be made that remains true today, that would we have been better off if we had tried to continue the kind of containment policy or pressure that had characterized U.S.-China relations in the 1950s and 1960s. And I think it's a hard case to make. So we certainly believed, and I think a case can be made that a prosperous China had a better chance of being a country that was respectful of the rights of both its own people and the rest of the world than one that was struggling. But we also never made our policy bet based on an assumption that that would come about. We thought it was important to give that opportunity a try, but also to recognize that the relationship was always going to be governed by what China did. And that, I think, has been a watchword of the policy through many administrations, through the Clinton administration, through President George W. Bush administrations, is that we had to create the possibility of cooperation without assuming that it was going to happen, to create an opportunity for reform to take place without assuming that anything that we did necessarily would guarantee that that would happen. And I think what we've heard today and what everybody has been able to observe is correct, which is that certainly our hopes for some of the changes we would have liked to have seen have not been realized. And I think that's an important part of what we have to address now and to try to understand why that might be the case. I think the single most important factor has been the difficulties that China has faced in trying to move from a country which was largely a relatively poor and relatively weak country to one which is now much more successful and much more capable. The relationship was built beginning in the Nixon years on a great asymmetry between the United States and China, both in military power and in economic clout. And that made the managing the relationship not easy, but it certainly was less challenging because China ultimately, as was seen from the Nixon years, was not going to be in any sense even capable of posing a serious threat to the United States. As China's been successful and that's brought so many benefits, it's been clear that the relationship needed to change. And I think to the extent that things have gone wrong, to use your words and the words that I used, it's by the failure of both of us to find a new basis for the relationship with a much stronger and much more capable China. Now, I say both of us, but I also have argued, and we'll be happy to elaborate today on the fact that there's a special responsibility for China in this case, as the rising power, as the country which potentially poses a threat to what was a very stable and prosperous East Asia and world. China has a special responsibility to show that it will use its increased capacity, its increased capability, not just for its own benefit and not to harm the interest of others. It's the great Peter Parker principle that with great power comes great responsibility. And I don't think that China has met that test.
Let's talk about one area in particular, Jim, that I know you followed closely, which is security relations. You know, China defense spending has increased 15% on average year over year since 2007. It now has the second largest defense budget in the world. They've exported arms to a number of different states. So, you know, in that context, how do we react? How do we show China the right way to act? And if they don't respond, is it still incumbent on us to cooperate?
You know, Bill, I mean, we can look at the absolute numbers of China's military spending. It has increased quite a bit. It's still significantly smaller than the amount that we spend. You know, I think Matt's reference to May 4th, and especially that very good discussion towards the end about that aspect of the May 4th movement, which was the determination of the Chinese people and the leaders of that movement not to be coerced by the rest of the world, explains why China, like any country, is going to do the things it needs to provide for its own security. So we shouldn't be surprised that China wants to feel secure. We want to feel secure. Why do we spend money ourselves on defense? We have a legitimate right and interest in doing that. The question is, how do we do it? How do we provide for our own security? How does China provide for its own security in a way that isn't threatening to others? So what bothers me is not the amount of money that China spends on defense or the military, it's how it does it. And to the extent that it's doing it by developing capabilities that are threatening to others and threaten the interests of others, by threatening the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, by making claims against territories and trying to use it, enforce them through coercion, as it's done against the Philippines and others, Vietnam, in the areas of the South China Sea, that's what of concern. China has a responsibility to show that while it's entitled to provide for its own security and to have the military means that are commensurate with its own economic and technological prowess, that it's not trying to do it at the expense of others, that it's not trying to succeed and provide for itself by harming the legitimate interests of others, China to Japan, to the countries of ASEAN, Korea, and others.
Jim, let's talk about COVID in that sense as well. I mean, we've all been looking at and talking about Chinese-U.S. cooperation on a range of global challenges. The cooperation during the Obama administration on climate change was a big breakthrough. And one would have thought, based on cooperation in previous pandemics, that U.S.-Chinese cooperation on this one would have been better. Matt, in his remarks, pointed to the lack of appreciation for dissenting voices in China, particularly to the physicians in Wuhan that pointed to the outbreak and the initial response as a failing. And now it's led to a lot of recrimination back and forth. Should we still cooperate with China on the outbreak of this? Is it still possible? Should we be pushing back on them? Why should or we shouldn't be treating this as, frankly, an act of irresponsibility on the Chinese parts as opposed to something on which we can cooperate together?
You know, I think the initial response by the Chinese leadership was both disturbing and frankly hard to understand. China had gone through the experience with SARS in 2002, 2003. And I think many people felt, and there's been actually some very great, interesting articles written, some postmortems on that experience that showed the inadequacies and the mistakes that were made in the handling of SARS, and the expectation that the Chinese leadership would have learned those lessons in terms of how to deal with these things and the need for openness and transparency in the early going, because that really was part of the reason why SARS initially seemed to get out of hand. And yet we saw, at least to the best I can judge, a lot of replication of the same kinds of behavior in response to COVID as we saw in the SARS crisis. So I think the world is entitled to be concerned about the lack of transparency, about the tendency to try to point fingers rather than to open up and to try to get the kind of help from the international community that was necessary. And there were clearly consequences associated with that. A better response by the Chinese early clearly would have made a difference. How much is hard to know. That having been said, there's plenty of time for the recriminations. Right now, what we need to focus on is how we best work together. Because frankly, even if China gets a hold of the COVID virus within China itself, even if we get a hold of it within the United States, we're all going to be affected by the spread around the world. And I think there's a very deep concern as COVID begins to spread to poorer and less capable countries about the long-term impacts that will have as well. So we'll have time enough to have the conversation. I think it's appropriate to have a serious investigation as to how this came about and what the responses were. But we need to focus right now on what we can do together to manage this, particularly because I think we all know that this is not a one-off thing, that we knew from the experience of the Spanish flu in 1917, 18, 19, that there will be subsequent waves, that we're all going to have to deal with this for an extended period of time and need to deal with both preventive and treatment measures over the coming years.
As you say, it is a big thing and we'll be dealing with it for some time, including the economic dimensions of it. We're all focused on that in the United States, but it's clearly been rocking the Chinese economy as well. And so one question's out there is if you see the relationship, or if one sees the relationship as a conflictual one, is Chinese economic weakness in our interest? Some people interpreted TPP, for instance, as an alliance of Western-oriented economies against China. Talk about that a little bit. Is the relationship, has it become, the economic relationship become inherently conflictual as opposed to cooperative? And do we have a mutual interest in growing our economies again? Or does this mark a real breaking point where we're going to be just flat out competing with the Chinese?
Well, we have a lot of experience from history about this. And one of the things we learned during the Great Depression was that when you're going into a depression, the last thing in the world you want to do is increase protectionism and decrease global demand, right? That precisely at times like this, we need more international cooperation. We need to find ways to stimulate demand, to stimulate economic growth, and that if each country tries to solve the problem unilaterally by closing its borders and trying to solve this problem nationally, it can only deepen the crisis. So I think history demonstrates to us why at a time like this, the last thing we want to do is try to beggar thy neighbor and to try to go this alone. We're not going to be able to sustain global growth if all of the major economies of the world are not growing. That means the United States, China, Europe, Japan, and the like. So just as we did in the face of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we need a global strategy to help stabilize the global economy, which is necessary for each of our national economies to grow. And it needs to remind us that some of the broader protectionist forces that have been troubling us even before the COVID outbreak are really threatening to all of our long-term prosperity. There are obviously issues around trade. We need to make sure that trade is fair and free, that there isn't intellectual property theft, that appropriate protection is given to labor and to the environment. But we still ought to be animated by a sense that we grow most effectively if we grow together as a global economy.
I'm going to ask you a question, Jim, that Doyle McManus of the LA Times had initially posed to Matt, and we weren't able to get it to it, but I think it's relevant to this point, and I'd love to hear your thought. Is the U.S. now in the equivalent of a Cold War with the PRC, a global struggle between competing systems? And is the U.S. doing enough to build and nurture alliances with other democratic natures to prevail against a competitor so skilled at divide and conquer?
Well, it's great to hear from Doyle, and he's been one of the great observers of this over his many years of distinguished journalism. I think that for a long time, there was a reluctance to think about Cold War analogies in thinking about Sino-US relations. But I regret to say that I think there are elements that are coming to bear here, most largely because I think that there is a growing tendency to see this relationship not just as a matter of economic competition, but of ideological competition. And that element of seeing this as ideological competition makes it much more difficult to cooperate. And I think that it tends to build a greater sense that our success depends on the other side's failure. That is, we would be better off, as was some suggested in the earlier discussion, if China didn't succeed, if it were weaker, if it didn't have the capacity to spend money on the military. And even the suggestion that Matt made that we made a mistake in letting China into WTO because it got prosperous and therefore more capable. Those have all the elements of a Cold War competition, and seeing everything in zero-sum terms. I mean, there's no doubt that there are aspects of the relationship which have zero-sum dimensions to it, but we also have tremendous areas of shared interest. And the COVID experience ought to remind us that in problems like this and climate change, as you mentioned, we have to be able to work together. That becomes very difficult in a Cold War framing in which our success is depend on their failure. So I think we are in danger of moving into that paradigm of seeing everything as it's either us or them. And I think we ought to avoid it. But I also, taking the implication of Doyle's question, say, even if we try to avoid the Cold War framework, that still doesn't mean we shouldn't try to strengthen our ties with our countries that share our interests and our values. We certainly are not going to be able to deal with China more effectively by going it alone. We need partners. And the most important reason for doing this is because many of the things that Matt said today in his critique of China and Chinese policy are absolutely right. But they'll be much more effective if they come from a group of countries together articulating this, rather than the United States being sort of seen as the country which is now making the indictment of China, because that builds the sense of Cold War confrontation, of bilateral confrontation. But if you have multiple voices, if you have our friends in Europe, our friends in Japan, our friends in Korea, our friends in Australia, all articulating the same message, it's harder for China to claim that this is just the United States trying to resist China's rise. So we need our friends and allies more than ever. And we need to make sure that we incorporate them into developing our own strategies to deal with the challenge posed by China.
A slightly different take on a similar set of questions, a question from Len Schappa, which was directed at Matt. Len is a senior professor here who's an expert in Japan, among other places, but also follows East Asia quite closely. I couldn't help but notice that Matt opted not to preface his remarks by saying these were his own views. The absence of this precedence and the fact that he was speaking from the White House with flags behind him suggests he is expressing the views of the president. Is the White House calling on China to rise up in populism against the Chinese party? This seems to be a pretty bold and risky diplomatic move, even if I share the sentiments. Is this likely to seriously worsen relations with China? Jim, you've sat in that office. You've had those flags behind you. As you watched that, what was your reaction to what you heard the White House essentially saying to the Chinese people directly?
So, I respect the challenge that the White House faces here, which is it has always been American policy to speak up for the values that we believe in. And one of those values is democracy. And I don't think there's anything wrong with an American official standing up and saying, as Matt did, that we believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We believe that it is not a culturally determined or civilizationally determined set of values, that countries all over the world subscribe to that convention and other related human rights principles, and that they are universal, and that we want for the Chinese people the same thing we want for ourselves and for every place else. And I think that willingness to speak for the universality of human rights and of human dignity is something that characterizes all American administrations. I think the challenge is to do it in a way that's respectful of the fact that different countries have sought to achieve that in different ways, and we need to respect that. We need to respect the achievements that the Chinese have brought over the last 70 years in terms of building a prosperous society that has created great opportunity. And so we need to find a way to be open and unafraid to speak about the values that we believe belong to everyone, in a way that recognizes that each country has to find a way to achieve those things. And so the voices that we think for openness, for transparency, for having the multiple voices that Matt talked about are things that have always been spoken from the White House. You'll recall, Bill, when President Clinton stood next to President Jiang Zemin in the Great Hall of the People and said, you know, we have a different view about the course of history and about the way these things go. And we think that some of the choices that China have made are on the wrong side of history. The president made that same similar remark in the White House when he stood with President Jiang Zemin when he came to Washington. So it's been a hallmark of American presidents, Democratic, Republican, to say that this is who we are as a people, and we will speak for this thing. But to understand that we don't do this in a way to try to harm China or to try to damage China, but rather because it's something we fundamentally believe in.
Jim, I want to come back to elements of cooperation and what we might have actually learned from the Chinese. We have a great question from the audience. But to the idea, if one interprets Len Schapa's question, that we might actually be interfering in domestic Chinese politics, what about the reverse? We all know China sought to interfere with the 2016 election. Are you worried about China interfering in 2020 here?
So I think you mean the Russian interference.
Russia interfering, yeah, I'm sorry, Russia interfering.
I understand.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, first of all, I think we cannot underestimate how much damage the efforts of the Russians in 2016 represents. And this is profoundly unacceptable behavior, right? And we need to be very, very clear that we are prepared to take measures to respond to this. And we're not going to sweep it under the rug or to pretend that it isn't consequential. Countries that engage in that kind of behavior, there ought to be consequences in our relationship with them if they do it. I have no reason to expect that the Chinese would do that, but I don't think we should take it for granted. I think we have to be alert to the possibility that they would do it. It's hard for me to think what would motivate them to do that, but it would be damaging. Again, you know, I don't have a problem with China's leadership speaking out about policies that we pursue that they think are wrong, just as we have no problem speaking out, but there's no place for under the table covert manipulation of media, deep fakes, and the kinds of things that we saw from 2016. So if the Chinese have a view and they want to take out ads in US newspapers to express that view, as long as they do it openly and publicly and allow us to debate, you know, the wisdom of having to do it, that part doesn't bother me. But I do think that we should, again, although I have no reason to think that they would do it, doesn't mean we should be complacent or just assume that. We need to be attentive to the possibility that they would do it. We also, frankly, Bill, need to be attentive to the possibility that people would try to manipulate this. The part of the danger here is that third parties have an interest in trying to stoke the flames, right? And so as we watch this, we want to make sure that we're alert, but also be cognizant of the fact that others may want to try to stimulate a sense of one or the other trying to undermine the other country, and make sure that if we do make accusations, that they're well founded.
So to the spirit of cooperation, Jim, in watching China's reaction internally to the COVID crisis, after their initial stumbles, if you just simply look at the numbers that are available, they largely contained the outbreak to Wuhan and to Hubei province. And they did a reasonably good job of shutting it down. And one can look at other East Asian countries and see similar successes. One can look to some countries in Europe that did quite well, Germany and Greece, and others that did poorly, Italy and the UK. Particularly looking at China, did you see things that we should be not just learning from, but cooperating with them on? And or how should we be thinking about the numbers coming out of China? And do you suspect that things are actually much worse there than they appear to be?
So I don't have any privileged information about what's going on. You know, I'm in touch with colleagues in China. It does appear that the Chinese government was reasonably successful in confining this to Wuhan, and I'm sure it would have been, you know, a major matter of enormous concern, because as bad as it was in Wuhan, imagine that replicated in Guangzhou, in Shanghai, and Tianjin, and elsewhere. but your question really shows, one, that there's nothing particular about the Chinese system or the role of the Communist Party or an authoritarian government in being successful in managing this. We've seen in a range of highly open, transparent democratic countries enormous success. And great credit is due, as Matt said, to the people in Taiwan and the government in Taiwan, in South Korea, in other countries about how they've done this. And I think that, you know, there are important lessons here, and it's why we need international cooperation. It's easy to criticize the WHO for its response. I've actually, in my classes over the years, had my students study how the WHO responded to the Ebola crisis to see whether our international organizations are up to the job in managing these transnational threats. And I think it's indisputably the case that the WHO was not as effective as it should have been. And it also seems clear that there wasn't as much cooperation by China with the WHO as there should have been. But right now, the WHO should be the forum for sharing experiences, for best practices, from what we can learn from each other. I think there's, you know, we look at the fact that other countries have done much better. They're different. They face different challenges from the United States. But we need fora like the WHO to be the place where the experts, the epidemiologists, the people who, you know, develop these kinds of social policies can work together to share their experiences, to learn from each other, and to make the international response both now in dealing with this particular disease and in subsequent ones as well, because this isn't the last pandemic we're going to face in the world. And we need the international capability. We need the resources and the expertise on a shared basis for the international community to work effectively together.
There's been a lot of commentary, Jim, not just on how China engaged with the WHO, but how they engaged with other countries, including Western democracies, in assessing the WHO and providing guidance. And then even more generally, broad comments about Chinese diplomacy post-COVID, assistance to other countries, rhetoric to other countries. What are you watching there and what are you seeing?
So I am disturbed by what we've seen, especially from Chinese diplomacy abroad. I think, you know, as we were talking about earlier, the question has always been, how would China use its growing capability and power? And would it use it in a way that was broadly in the interest of the international community as a whole, the kind of rhetoric that President Xi has used when he went to Davos and talked about his commitment to globalization, or whether China would try to use its clout to try to coerce and intimidate other countries. And we have seen instances in recent weeks where it seems to be the latter. And I think that that's deeply disturbing, and it will lead countries appropriately to draw inferences about how China sees its ability to use this capability and this power that it's accumulated over recent years, and to draw the appropriate lessons. I think the Chinese leadership needs to really look seriously at how countries are reacting, because not only is it causing great negative reactions around the world to Chinese diplomacy, but ultimately it's going to harm China itself if other countries are going to take measures in response to it. So I think we are at a watershed moment, and I think it's a time for reflection by everyone to see how their response to this difficult period of time, does it enhance the long-term interests of their country, or will it have adverse consequences that will just only deepen the divide just between China and the United States, but between China and other countries around the world?
Jim, how are you thinking about the broader science and technology issues? We'll be getting into some of these today. The debates over 5G, the debates over the internet within China and regulation of internet-based companies in the United States that might want to market to China. Do you think COVID will be a setback for a lot of those efforts to try to effectively negotiate and cooperate with China? Or do you think there's an opportunity to have a reset post-COVID?
I hope it's the latter, Bill, because I think that COVID demonstrates why we need to do this. You know, and I think that it's important to try to disaggregate some of the issues here. There's no place for any, you know, theft of commercial property or industrial secrets that are, you know, what power the private sector, which, you know, companies invest in, and they're entitled to protect. And China, in principle, has agreed to protect these things. And we ought to be very clear and tough-minded about making sure that none of that takes place. But there's a different question when it comes to basic scientific research and technology. And there, I think we're beginning to see the same kind of competition infect, or if I could use the words, probably an inappropriate choice here, the relationship in areas where we ought to be cooperating. So in terms of basic scientific research, basic biomedical research, we're now starting to see both sides seeing this as something that one side or the other should benefit, and we need to try to reduce the degree of cooperation that we have by researchers in basic science and physics and biology and chemistry in both of our countries. We need more of that kind of cooperation. We need to understand that when it comes to trying to understand how to deal with the problems of cancer, how to cure viruses like COVID, that we need the best minds in both of our countries and all of our countries to be working together. So we need to create more space for that kind of cooperation while legitimately protecting industrial and commercial secrets and protecting them from inappropriate expropriation.
Jim, John Zemansky has an extended question that we can send to you, but to summarize, he talks about the diversity within China. And this is particularly meaningful for me with respect to you, and that some people in the audience know I wrote a book about the provinces of China steered by you, including steering me to spend time in Chengdu in Sichuan province. As you watched the rise of Xi Jinping, the central control, the return to a more centralized and authoritarian China, and the reaction to COVID in China, and how do you see that playing out? I know it's a little bit hard to see this, but China is enormously diverse, and a moment like this can be a shock to the system. What are you watching for there? What are you able to see right now?
You know, my own experience is like yours, Bill, which is, you know, I've been privileged to be able to spend a fair amount of time in China over the years. I still go back and teach visiting classes in China quite regularly and meet with the students and the faculty there. And, you know, I remain encouraged. I still see people who are similar to you and I and all of the people who are listening to this around the world. They're inquiring minds. They want to have different sources of opinion. They'll have different opinions, right? And they won't always agree with us. But I think that genuine open spirit, this inquiry, this desire to know and to hear different voices is universal and is as present in China. And I fundamentally believe that over time that spirit will triumph, that it is impossible for ideological uniformity to be imposed, no matter how draconian the measures, no matter how much technology may be able to implement surveillance or social credit scoring and the like, that basic human spirit that wants to question, to challenge, to know, to ask why, is going to prevail in China just like it prevails every place else. And I would hope that the Chinese leadership would understand that in the long term, it's in the interest of the leadership itself. I know that they're proud of the accomplishments that the Communist Party has brought to China over the past 70 years, and deservedly so. But to the extent that it is proud of those achievements, it ought to be willing to have them debated openly and to make the case to the Chinese people about why the system is more effective and better than others, rather than trying to make sure that those voices aren't heard. I think that in the end of the day, that spirit will triumph. It will triumph around the world. I'm a deep believer in that, and that governments, no matter how capable, ultimately can't suppress that basic feature of human nature.
It's a good transition to a question from Dale Copeland, who's a professor in the politics department here and a Miller Center senior fellow. And he tries to get at the tension in strategy between economic cooperation and conflict and strategic cooperation, national security cooperation. And he suggests that that one strategy would be to continue and maybe even return to economic cooperation while being more hard-headed on the national security cooperation. We've almost seen the inverse of that during the Trump administration, where they've been so hard in competing on the economic side and have been less vocal on the security side. Could you see a return to that, particularly as both economies are trying to come out of probably a recession, maybe a depression? Or do you foresee tough competition in both realms?
So it's a great question, but I'm very skeptical because I believe that if we view each other as truly strategic rivals and potentially enemies, then we have to worry about the other's success, and that we get to a point where any form of technological cooperation potentially could contribute to the military capabilities of the others, and so all technology cooperation becomes suspect. Any economic dependence becomes a potential point of weakness or vulnerability. And so the dynamic that we're seeing now, I think, and this broadening of the tensions between our countries to get into the economic sphere is precisely a product of the fact that we're seeing each other as strategic rivals. So I don't think you can insulate the economic cooperation from this if we see each other as genuine rivals, as opposed to countries which have differences of interest. I mean, I think we don't have to have an identity of interest. We can have points of disagreement, but if it's a true rivalry, it is almost inherently zero sum. And I think it's almost impossible to insulate the economic sphere from that.
Mm-hmm. Riga Tenzin asks a question. The term you coined, strategic reassurance, be compared to détente with the Soviet Union in the early years of the Cold War. And just playing that question out, détente was followed by a much more ideologically sharp Reagan administration, in a sense, prefaced a little bit by Carter. And that led in its own way to certain challenges on the U.S.-Russian relationship moving forward. How do you think about that? If we are coming back into, or right now in a period that is starting to look like the Cold War, is strategic reassurance essentially a new form of détente?
I think it's a slightly different approach to a similar question, which is the idea here is to find ways to assess what the long-term intentions of each side are, and to give each side a chance to demonstrate that it wants to pursue its interests in ways that are compatible with the interests of the other side. So if you look at the experience of détente in the mid and late 1970s, one can argue that the Nixon administration, in effect, created space for the Soviet Union to demonstrate what its long-term intentions were, and that the behavior of the Soviet Union in the second half of the 1970s demonstrated, at least to some, that the intentions were not very good, whether it had to do with the missile buildups in the Soviet Union, or the invasion of Afghanistan, or the activities of the Soviet Union in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. The conclusion that was drawn was that the Soviet Union was not respecting the idea of not impinging on the interest of others. And so you can see the Reagan or even the late Carter administration reactions as one is saying, okay, we gave them a chance to show what their intentions are. Here's the conclusions that we draw. Now you can argue, and I know you have several good colleagues there, including Mel Leffler, who would say maybe we didn't interpret those actions by the Soviet Union correctly, but it is the same idea, which is to give China the opportunity to demonstrate how it's going to use its power and to draw conclusions accordingly. And I think the concern right now is whether China's recent actions, particularly the kinds that you and I just talked about in terms of this implied elements of coercion that we've been hearing from some of the Chinese diplomats, is China showing its real hand? Because the flip side of strategic reassurance is, as the title of the book says, is strategic resolve, which is that if China is not prepared to provide the kind of reassurance that its neighbors in the United States is entitled to, then we should draw the adverse conclusions from that and be prepared to deal with a much more contentious relationship.
So Jim, we have time for one more question. We started a little late because of Matt's session going late. So I'm gonna end where, in some level, not you and I fully began, but where at least my own work on climate change began. U.S. China cooperation on climate change was essential during the Obama administration. It led to the breakthrough at Paris. The Trump administration then walked back on the Paris Accord. If one looks forward to a Biden administration, do you expect this to come back? And what is required for that, including for the Chinese to trust the United States? We went back on a global agreement that we pushed them hard to cooperate on. How does one put that Humpty Dumpty back together again?
So it's a challenge. And I think that part of the problem here is not only a question of who's president of the United States, although obviously it's consequential, and I'll pass on expressing an opinion on that. People can probably surmise my view. But we need a broader national consensus, because I think it's very difficult to move forward even if you have a president who wants to move in one particular direction, if there's not a sufficient support in the Congress and in the American public. You'll recall, Bill, very well what happened after the Kyoto Agreement, right? Which was the president believed, despite the flaws and the very evident flaws of the Kyoto Agreement, it was important for us to try to move the process forward by agreeing. But President Clinton did not have the backing of the Congress, and especially of the United States Senate, in taking that forward. And so what we need to do, and the next president, whether it's President Trump or President Biden or whoever, needs to figure out, how do we develop a sustainable long-term approach to global cooperation? The direction we're going is not one I think that's good for the United States, but you can't simply have a president come in and say, well, I'm going to do it completely different. I'm going to rejoin Paris, if the Congress isn't prepared to support the kinds of measures that you need to do to implement the kinds of commitments that we made in the Paris Agreement. So I think it's important to use this time to remind ourselves why global cooperation is important, why it's in the interest of the United States to be in treaties like the Paris Climate Accord, and to build the kind of grassroots support and congressional support that we need to carry forward and to sustain it, so that we don't have these oscillations in the US involvement, and other countries will see the United States as a good and sustainable partner.
Well, Jim, thank you for joining us for that extraordinary sweep of the top to bottom and left to right in the sense of U.S.-Chinese relations. You're an incredible resource for the country and for the world, and we're really appreciative that you beamed in with us today.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thanks to so many for being willing to participate remotely, and I hope everybody stays well and safe.
We look forward to bringing you back to Charlottesville. I'm going to throw it now back to Harry Harding, who is I should have mentioned, in Taipei with Shirley. They were stranded there as the pandemic broke out, and we look forward to getting them back to Charlottesville too. Harry is, as I mentioned before, a professor at the Batten School of Public Policy and Leadership here at UVA, and a senior fellow at the Miller Center. Harry, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. We're now going to start our panel discussion on the prospects for competition and cooperation in science and technology. As all of us know, the U.S.-China relationship will most likely involve a mixture of cooperation and competition going forward, with the possibility of confrontation looming in the background as well. The competition and cooperation will play out in a variety of arenas, bilaterally, regionally, and globally. And one of the most important of these arenas will be science and technology. Our panelists today will each address one aspect of science and technology about which they are particularly knowledgeable. For the sake of time, I won't introduce them in any detail, but their biographies are on the Miller Center website, and I encourage you to take a look when you have the opportunity. In the order in which they will be making their opening remarks, they are: first, Evan Feigenbaum, the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He'll be discussing the national security challenges produced by new technologies and the prospects for both competition and cooperation between China and the United States in this area. Evan Pottinger, Senior Lab Advisor at ICAP, a program at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Policy, originally focused on AIDS prevention and treatment, and now deals with a much wider range of public health issues around the world. Before joining ICAP, she was the team lead at the HIV incidence team at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She'll discuss the prospects for Sino cooperation on COVID-19 and future pandemics. And as those of you who heard Matt Pottinger's earlier presentation and noticed the similarity in surnames, yes, Ying is Matt's wife. The next speaker will be Sam Ramasubramanian, the Vice President for Research and Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at University of Virginia. He'll be discussing the prospects for cooperation between Chinese and American researchers on solutions to other major global issues and the challenges to that cooperation posed by U.S. government concerns around China's talent and intellectual property acquisition strategies. Finally, Ann Kokas, Assistant Professor of Media Studies and a Faculty Senior Fellow at the Miller Center and Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress. She'll be discussing today her current research under the title Border Control on the Digital Frontier, which examines the risks and opportunities surrounding the storage of personal data collected through new forms of surveillance. After the panelists make their opening remarks, the session will be moderated both by me and by Shirley Lin, who, as many of you now know, is the Compton Visiting Professor in World Politics at the Miller Center, who also teaches at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and Tsinghua University in Beijing. And in the spirit of full disclosure, Shirley is my wife. Now, please feel free to post your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom throughout the panel discussions. They can be addressed to any one of the panelists or to all of them. So let's turn first to our first presentation, which is by Evan Feigenbaum. Over to you, Evan.
Great. Well, thanks, Harry, and good to see everybody in this new Zoom era. I should start with an apology. As Harry said when he introduced me, I'm this year the Schlesinger Professor at the University of Virginia in the Miller Center. I haven't done a lot of professing thanks to the virus, so it's a pleasure to be able to do this even this way. And as I've told Bill Antholis and Harry and Shirley, I'll try to make it up to you when we all get out from this semi-lockdown that we're in. As Harry said, I've been asked to talk about the national security aspects of technology. And I'm delighted to do it for two reasons. The first is that in many ways, China really has had an integrated approach to technology development for 70 years. I wrote a PhD dissertation on a book on it many, many lifetimes ago. It goes to the way technology is developed in China. It was initially a reaction to the Korean War. But it's also true, frankly, that the United States has in many ways had an integrated approach to technology. And despite the stories that we tell ourselves, the origin of many aspects of technology development in the United States, particularly in the pre-World War II period and then coming out of World War II, also owes a lot to military and civilian and commercial integration. But the second reason is that technology really, for me, encapsulates what I think is increasingly the central dynamic in the U.S. China relationship today, and that is the bleeding of security-related interests, concepts, and ideas into pretty much every aspect of the U.S. China relationship. Or to put that another way, the refracting of various interests between both the U.S. and China through the prism of security-related competition. And I want to talk about that. I thought I would do that for you in three, let's call them bites. First, I'll talk a little bit about the collision between economics and security. Second, about the nature of innovation and how it's changing and where the focus is, particularly in China. And last, I'll just say something quickly about what I would call the collision between Chinese impulses to indigenization and the growing impulses in the United States to what I would call de-integration. A good place to start, I think, is with a speech that Vice President Mike Pence gave. It seems like a lifetime ago now with COVID, but just last October. And he said two things that were interesting, but to my mind, actually flatly contradictory. In the speech, he talked a lot about technology. And I'm going to read you a quote. He said that China had, quote, smashed the barriers between civilian and military technological domains. But then later in the speech, he made this rather, I think, flatly contradictory statement of policy. He said, you know, people sometimes ask whether the Trump administration seeks to decouple from China. And he said, the answer is a resounding no. Here's the problem. If the vice president is right, that China, as in his first statement, leverages all technology for military purposes, then frankly, the United States should have no interest in enabling flows of capital, people, hardware, or software that might aid in the military modernization of a competitor. So reconciling those two statements is part of the challenge we have. To understand why it's challenging and also what's happened, I think it's useful just to begin, and I know we'll flesh this out in the discussion, by stepping back and thinking about this in terms of those 3 bites I laid out at the outset. And I think a lot of what's happened is structural. It's not a Donald Trump phenomenon. It's not just a Xi Jinping phenomenon. And a lot of it, I think, will be persistent in the U.S. China relationship. So first, economics and security. I think the central dynamic, frankly, in the U.S. China relationship increasingly is the collision between economics and security, or to put that another way, between forces of economic integration and security fragmentation. If you go back to the origin of the contemporary relationship between the United States and China, the contemporary official relationship, it began when Richard Nixon landed in Beijing in February 1972. But that was a point when the United States and China were fighting a proxy war in Vietnam, and where China was still crawling its way out of the Cultural Revolution. So from the very inception of the contemporary relationship, the United States and China had colliding security concepts and obvious differences of political system and ideology. And the relationship developed over many decades, notwithstanding that, but it's been a feature, not a bug of the relationship. Now, that's important because particularly after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, I think a working theory of the case that a lot of people had was that economic integration would mitigate those disruptive and debilitating forces of security competition. But if you think about it, we're now, 19 years since China went in the WTO. And not only has economic integration not mitigated security competition, but if anything, security competition is getting worse. And you see that on a daily basis in the South China Sea. You see it in the Taiwan Strait. You see it all around China's periphery. You see it, frankly, in the way Matt talked a little bit about the U.S.-China relationship, and Jim as well. So not only has economic integration not mitigated security competition, but if anything, I want to argue to you, security is now bleeding back into every other area of the relationship, disrupting flows of capital, of people, and of technology. And if you think about it, the United States and China are enormously integrated economically. Enormously integrated. They have a 700 billion plus trading relationship. There's over $100 billion in US foreign direct investment stock in China. The capital controls and other factors have reduced the Chinese deal flow into the United States. But in 2016, there was something like 50 billion in Chinese deal flow into the United States, much of that technology related, some of it into Silicon Valley growth companies. And yet, despite all that integration, including the integration of people, students, scholars, exchanges, this security competition is intensifying. So essentially, the first dynamic that you have is the refraction of so much of what should and could and was supposed to define the integration of the two economies, the two technology establishments, through the prism of security competition. And what that's meant, in effect, is that it's created a fertile ground for what I would call techno-nationalism to thrive, rather than these concepts of techno-globalism, let's call it, to simplify. Techno-nationalism, it's not a new phenomenon. There have been techno-nationalists in every country over a long time. A lot of people in the United States, when they look at China's strategic technology development plans that are state-led, for instance, in the 1980s, for example, the so-called 863 plan. Today, you hear people talking about Made in China 2025, which is a Chinese industrial plan. Those plans actually, in many ways, have been modeled on plans that have been developed in other countries. For Made in China 2025, China looked at Germany's Industry 4.0, at some of the industrial structure vision plans that METI, the Japanese Economy Ministry, has developed over time. And so in some respects, China's not different, but in others it is. But the point I want to make to you, and this is the first high-level point, is that as this security prism has bled into other areas of the relationship, it's created the opportunity for really a much more techno-national approach to technology development to thrive. And to see that, really just step back and think about what I would call the school child's, 5 W's and 1 H. What, who, where, when, why, how. What technologies do countries need to develop? A lot of the technologies that China is focused on, those plans, are highly strategic technologies that have dual and multiple use applications. Who then should develop them? I think both in the United States and China, there are voices and forces that argue we, not they, to put it simply, should be the ones to develop them. When should these be developed? Well, as quickly as possible. Many governments now talk about a race to the future, the race for 5G, the race for quantum. You can see this in all of the national documents that governments put out, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say to you is that the more you take a security perspective on the integration of flows of capital, of people, and technology, the more it lends itself to a much more zero-summy way of designing policies and thinking about what the other side is doing. Now that brings me to my second point, which is really about the way in which the flow of innovations in technology has changed over time. There are tales we tell ourselves in the United States about how innovation is developed. We talk about Silicon Valley as being, two people in a garage, tinkering with things, developing ideas. That is one piece of the story. But if you read a lot of the interesting scholarship on the history of science, including on the early history of Silicon Valley, it's also true, as Peter Galison, a historian of science at Harvard, has put it, that Silicon Valley prospered, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, because of plentiful sunshine and also even more plentiful government money, much of which was steered into military electronics contracts. So even in the United States, there's always been some integration between commercial innovation and military innovation and things that have multiple use applications. But if I think about the flow of innovations really from the 1940s to say the 1960s, there were a lot of ways in which military-related innovation led the development of commercial innovation. Coming out of World War II, you had these, I would call them the four war babies of technology. It was German rocketry, American computing, British radar, and American atomic bombs. And those four areas of technology really led a lot of commercial and civilian-related innovation in the late 1940s into the 1950s. But by the 1960s on, really the flow of innovations reversed. It had a lot to do with the developments of semiconductors, commercial microelectronics, and a lot of the really disruptive military innovation depended and flowed from changes in civilian and commercial innovation, really around commercial microelectronics. And so we went from conceptions of spin off from military innovation to people writing books and articles with where they coined this term spin on. And that's not surprising given the changing nature of technology and also the changing nature of weaponry in that period. So if you want to design a more effective inertial guidance system for missiles, it depended a lot on many of the innovations that happened, not in a narrowly military sense, but in the civilian sphere. If I think about how technology is evolving today, things like artificial intelligence enabled applications, new and special materials, many of the things that Chinese laboratories are seeking to develop, but also things that are happening between American and Chinese technology developers and innovators are things that have multiple applications, can be used to do all sorts of things. It's not just that they're dual use, it's that they're multiple use. And that's caught the attention, I think, of a lot of people in the United States, and particularly policymakers who look at where China is trying to develop comparative advantages and doing it in the context of a system that, as I said at the outset, really has been quite integrated in many ways. So if you think about how innovation is evolving, it is inevitable that many of the AI-enabled applications that can be used for all sorts of exciting and interesting commercial innovations also have military applications and implications, and that's caught the attention of some American policymakers. So that brings me to my third and last point, and that really gets to where we are in the relationship. And I think, to be blunt about it, that I think on the American side, American policy is heading in a direction that I wouldn't call decoupling. And I've never liked the term decoupling because it implies that the United States and China are a couple. And in a couple, you can divorce if you're a couple, but the United States and China are not a couple because other countries get to have a vote here. And frankly, I think there are some American policies that are heading in a direction that runs the risk of trying to attenuate China's progress, but ends up sequestering a lot of technology inside the United States itself. And we can talk about that in the discussion if you'd like. But where I see American policy going, and then I'll come to Chinese policy, is really a growing emphasis on de-integration, which is a term I prefer to decoupling, that collides in many ways with impulses to what I would call indigenization in China. There are three elements of that that really I've noticed. One, and I'm just going to be blunt about it, is that I think there's a growing interest in using export controls in the United States in much more elastic and comprehensive ways that are designed, to be very candid, to attenuate China's progress with certain technologies. These are things that flow from two pieces of legislation, the Export Control Reform Act, but also the so-called Foreign Investment Risk Review and Modernization Act, that has the potential to, as I said, attenuate flows of capital in both directions, but also flows of people and flows of technology. And there are people who work on export controls in the United States who have discovered that they can expand the use of export controls in ways that were always there in a latent sense, but have become much more expansive, creative, and elastic. I'd encourage you to look, if you're interested in this, at some of the ways in which the Commerce Department is using rulemaking and executive branch action to really try, I would argue, to attenuate China's progress in certain areas of technology. That is much more challenging, I think, in a real world sense than it is in the design of rules on paper, and we can get into that as well. But I do think, frankly, that that is the intent of policy, and it has a lot of cheerleaders on a bipartisan basis across Washington, including on Capitol Hill. A second aspect of American policy that I see evolving is the attempt to, again, to be blunt about it, to reduce the exposure of U.S. entities of all kinds, corporate, educational, and laboratory-based, to co-innovation partnerships with China.